there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest Friday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, where, as always, we fling open the doors of your local comic book shop and bring you interviews of your favorite comic book creators of yesterday and today. And this episode is no different. But before we get to that, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And today we're bringing you someone who has quite an interesting career, both in comics and comics adjacent. We're talking about none other than Jeff Rovin. Chances are, if you've played video games in the late 80s, early 90s, you've seen his work. He wrote a lot of the how-to books and how to beat and play certain video games, such as Super Nintendo, Mario Brothers, and Sega Genesis games. All those, guides and how to beat certain games and like where to go and get, extra lives and stuff. Well, he wrote those things, and pretty interesting that someone actually took the time out to do that.
Yeah, my source of those, besides all of that, is he was actually pretty much the guy in charge of Atlas Comics in the 70s. I know Archie Goodwin was the head of it, but it was Jeff who was sort of making sure the books were getting out on time, working with the different talent, getting things together. I know Atlas didn't last very long, but you're going to love to hear Jeff's stories about his time there.
Yeah, Jeff is a real fascinating guy. So not only did he work with video games, not only did he work with Atlas and also DC, so in comics, but he also was a huge and is a huge nonfiction writer. Wrote a lot of reference books, including the Encyclopedia of Cartoon Animals, the Encyclopedia of Superheroes, of Supervillains, biographies of such folks as Richard Pryor, Joan Collins, even Ellen DeGeneres, Jackie Chan. So just what a fascinating guy, and now works at the Weekly World News. So I'm sure you've seen that in the supermarket and some interesting content there. So let's get to it. This is Jeff Rovin.
Rovin, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
So the first question we ask everyone is, how did you first discover comics?
I suppose like most people of my generation, which was in the 50s, you would be going with your parents to when they bought cigarettes or something in the local candy store, and there were comics. And I was forbidden to get them, but that didn't stop me. And I learned how to sneak them in under my shirt and stuff like that. But in all fairness to my parents, we didn't have a ton of money, and it was an indulgence.
Now,
no, I was going to say, but I was it was an issue of Superman that I first got, and I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and boy, that's all I can say.
well, what was it about it that captured you so much?
First of all, most people in my age group were familiar with the George Reeves TV series. It was in syndication, and it was also in black and white because color TVs were not really around then. So to see Superman in color on the cover of a comic book, trapped inside of some kind of a glass cylinder in outer space, was just something that I couldn't grasp how just somebody came up with this, or what is it? I loved it. I just loved it. And I think, like most people, these stayed dog-eared and folded up in your pocket. And then it was particularly exciting when the 80-page giants started coming out, Superman and Batman in particular, because we knew nothing of the Golden Age or of any of the earlier comic books, and it was so exciting.
Now, do you still have that comic?
The earliest comic that I have that I bought was a detective comic, I think from 1960, so that was a little bit later, of a giant green alien crushing the Batplane and Batman and Robin parachuting out. And a Star-Spangled War Stories comic with a Tyrannosaurus crushing a tank. I remember that. I still have that.
People forget that was part of the World War II, the Tyrannosaurus attacks as well too. So
yeah, that was so thrilling.
So
I just want to add. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to add in a kind of a cultural context because television, if you had it at all, was appointment television, and you weren't allowed to use it a lot. And there were certain hours when the TV just wasn't on, in the sense that there was no broadcasting. And occasionally there would be a movie for us, like when the Steve Reeves Hercules picture first came out, or the original Godzilla, Rodan. But the sense of wonder stuff was rare, and so we cherished every particle of it.
That's a really, really good point to have there. And, you know, it helps your imagination so much when you got to see things like that.
Yeah, and then, well, of course, it was both of those plus television were visual, and that led us. It was a kind of a gateway sense of wonder to Edgar Rice Burroughs when he came back into print, and Doc Savage when we discovered that. And all of a sudden, this it was like a pocket universe had exploded, and really, we were just gathering everything we could. The Mars Attacks trading cards, when those came out, right? George Powell, War of the Worlds, The Blob. It was also wonderful, but it was relatively rare compared to today.
I just want to mention, because you just brought them up, the Topps War of the Worlds trading cards. What was that like for you? Because the art on that is absolutely mind-blowing. But as a kid, to get those and see stuff like that.
Yeah, the Mars Attacks, and also the Civil War cards that had come out too. They were both gory. They were explosive. They made very little sense if you thought about it. All of a sudden, there's giant bugs and a giant robot. Where'd they come from? And then there were GIs on Mars, bashing in Martian heads while they were drinking champagne. It was wondrous insanity, but we just took it all in. And I have to give a shout out to Jim Warren and Famous Monsters of Filmland, and Spacemen and Screen Thrills Illustrated. Those were lifelines to the industry, to the past.
Now, at what point did you decide that comics might be a career you might wanted to pursue as an adult?
Well, there are two things. First, I didn't have the grades or the money for college, so the idea that I was going to get an education in anything was ludicrous, and I also wasn't interested in that. I spent 3 weeks at the School of Visual Arts, but that was kind of the headquarters of the counterculture revolution, and there was a lot of pot and drugs, and that was not for me. So I left SVA and made my way up to Skywald Comics, which had just started, Saul Brodsky, and I talked my way in there. I was my only editorial experience at that point had been as a proofreader for Ian Ballantine. Now, Ian Ballantine, who founded Ballantine Books, was one of the inventors of the paperback. And he had started a new imprint, and actually a new publishing company called Beagle Books. And there was an ad for a proofreader. So I went up, and he asked me, he said, look, we're bringing, because he had brought Tolkien back into print at Ballantine, he said, we're bringing H.P. Lovecraft back into print. Do you think you could proofread that? And I spelled Cthulhu for him on the spot. And I was hired on the spot. And since that point, I felt as if the universe was kind of pushing me in various directions that were close enough to this one path of comics and science fiction. So I'd worked there for a while, proofreading Lovecraft and other Beagle books, and then I went up to see Saul Brodsky, and he also needed a proofreader, and so he made me assistant editor up there, and that was it. There was no going back then.
You know, Skywald kind of gets lost a bit in the shuffle, but they put out, some nice Western books, some horror books as well. What was that experience like there, and what did you think of the comic process from what you were seeing?
Skywald published, first of all, the black and white magazines were the ones that really interested me. They were Nightmare and Psycho. And one day I got on the phone. One of the writers was Jerry Siegel, and I was speechless, just like I am now. I was speechless. You're talking to Jerry Siegel, but he was really uh, um, he was broke, and so he was writing for Skywald. He was pumping out scripts. Uh, Jeff Jones was there. He was just starting out. Ernie Colon, I met him there, and in fact, Skywald had a line of color comics, The Heap, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There was a Jungle comic too. I think that's may have been the title, Jungle Comics. Anyway, we actually wanted to pitch a comic to Saul Brodsky, so I came up with Tiger Man, and it was inspired by the old Steve Reeves movie Goliath and the Barbarians, where he put on a tiger mask and had these raking claws. And unfortunately, the color line folded before I got to even pitch it to him, so I put it in a drawer. But as I said, the universe always makes its own plans. So Skywald, yeah, it got lost, but it was in the shadow of Jim Warren's aggressive marketing, and we just didn't have the money to compete with that. A lot of the printing was done in Canada, and it's not a knock on Canada, but it was really not up to Warren quality. So we were always a kind of a bastard stepchild, and didn't really last very long.
But as a young man and a comic fan, to say you're working every day with Saul Brodsky, and like you just said, you got Jerry Siegel on the phone, that must have been absolutely mind blowing.
And one day Bill Everett walked in because he was doing pinup posters, and because I'd read Jules Pfeiffer's, of course, the great comic book heroes. Bill Everett, we're talking the Submariner here, back in the old days of, of course, this was 71, and Everett was an old timer. But in addition to those people, there were a lot of newcomers like Pablo Marcos, who was just starting out there. I know Marv Wolfman was writing there. A whole bunch of really terrific people, and it was great to be around them, and Saul as well.
Now, from there, did you go to? I think you went to DC, or
Correct.
Okay, and how was that experience going to a bigger company than from where Skywald was?
Well, I actually saw Bob Kane in person as opposed to talking to Jerry Siegel on the phone. It was difficult to remain professional, and but I mean, that was to be working with and for Carmine Infantino, who was the publisher. I was Joe Kubert's assistant. I was Joe Orlando's assistant. I was working with Dorothy Woolfolk, who had been married to Bill Woolfolk of Captain Marvel fame. Dorothy was editing Lois Lane, so I was working on that. Vince Coletta was inking in the office. They were just, it was so exciting. And one of the first projects I was given, we had most of one floor of 909 Third Avenue, and another magazine had just moved in. And Carmine called me into the office one day and said, "Jeff, go to the library and help this woman. She's doing a Wonder Woman book." Well, it was Gloria Steinem, and she had just started Ms. Magazine, and she wanted to do a collection of Wonder Woman stories. And so she said to me, "I want to do a book that shows Wonder Woman as a strong woman." And I looked at Gloria and I said, "Well, she's Wonder Woman. She's always strong." And so she said, "No, that's not what I mean." And so my 20-year-old self got an education in what was then called women's liberation, and I think Wonder Woman was on the cover of the first issue. And boy, to go through the DC library and look through these fragile old comics, and yes, I did go look at Action Comics and Detective 27 and all of those it was all there. And the thing is there were virtually no safeguards. There was a woman, Gerda Gattel. She had the keys, but once you were in there, that was it. Nobody was watching you, except for Michael Fleischer, who came up to write his Encyclopedia of Superheroes. So he was around a lot, which is where I met him.
You hear a lot about, Marvel at the time and the Marvel method, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and all these young writers. It seemed like Marvel was a much looser kind of environment. Was DC a little more buttoned up, a little more business-like from your perspective?
Oh, more than a little. The editors like Julius Schwartz, Murray Boltinoff, Joe Kubert, Joe Orlando, Dorothy were very traditional. They wanted scripts, they wanted plotting, and I know you've spoken to Jim Shooter. He must have talked about some of those early days. But the thing is, you learn so much about all of that from someone like Julie. And Gardner Fox was up there, Arnold Drake, all of these people who had paid their dues and knew their stuff. And if I had been smarter, I would have asked them more questions. But I was tongue-tied half the time. And George Cashton was another one. My favorite was John Albano. He was just the jauntiest, most creative guy that I met on the writing side. There was also a bullpen in the sense that it was a coffee room where guys like Neil Adams would go and Howie Chaykin. And so I got to meet all of those guys there. And they were all just starting out, Mike Kaluta. And Joe Orlando was keen to give everybody, all of them, a shot. And he was very much a mentor. But everybody would just hang out in that coffee room. Neil would be drawing pages of Batman and all of that. And yeah, wow.
We've spoken to some folks, and they had felt that there was a bit of a divide between the younger talent coming in, the established people who were there. Did you see them mingling together, or was there sort of a separation between the established and the new folks?
There was absolutely a separation, and it's good that you bring that up because they were the young Turks, the up and comers. They hung around a lot of Continuity Studios, which was Neil and Dick Giordano's studio, not too many blocks away. But I think the older generation was a little bit more suspicious because you had guys like Murphy Anderson who never missed a deadline. You had Nick Cardy who never missed a deadline. You had Frank Thorne who not only never missed a deadline but was actually faster than Joe Kubert, who was fast. And so there was a natural suspicion of people who kind of didn't always do that, and frustration as well. And I know that when it's still, over 50 years later, it's still strange for me to say. And when Bill Gaines joined the organization, still, Carmine would have Gaines was kind of a supervisor over Carmine, which didn't sit too well with Carmine. But the comics were not doing well. And Gaines and Mad Magazine were doing well, and they were now part of the same corporate structure. So I would run stuff over from DC to Mad, and Mad was way different. You walked into Gaines's office, and there was that giant King Kong in the window. There was a false front and a gorilla looking in behind it, and there was Bill Gaines. And I just, again, it was, what the hell am I doing here? What's wrong with this picture? And all of the original art from the covers, the Kelly Freas stuff on the walls. And, Gaines was just so laid back. And of course, we knew less then than we do now, but we knew about his testimony before Congress, the Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, and his courage. And wow, again, there were a million things I should have asked him, but didn't. So anyway, but yeah, there was definitely, and Marvel was way different. at Marvel, you had the creators, which were, ruled over by Stan, and then you had Martin Goodman. He was the only corporate buttoned up kind of guy. And Martin was, even in that, he was not very orthodox. He had probably a dozen shell companies, Vista Publications, Non-Pareil Publications, all of that, and was constantly moving money around. So he stuck to his stuff, and Stan stuck to his stuff, and yeah, but it was a very much a different environment.
Well, you bring Stanley up, and the documentary about him came out a little while ago, and I know it rubs some people the wrong way. It seems to be a hot button topic now. What were your thoughts of Stan and his working with him and his approach?
I was, of course, a fan, but I was also a fan of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. Let's face it. I liked Stan a lot as a person. I thought he was accessible, he was genuine, and I know for a fact he was caring, because a number of years later, when Larry Lieber was hired to work at Atlas, I got a call from Stan, and he asked me to, if I wouldn't mind getting together with him, or at least calling him once a week and let him know how Larry was doing, because he was very concerned that out from under his protective umbrella and under the direct supervision of Martin, who was not a kind taskmaster, Larry might not do well. And so for the entire time I was there, I was talking to Stan. He never asked, what's happening editorially, what's happening with sales. I mean, he had his own sources, I'm sure, but it was nothing like any kind of industrial espionage or anything like that. And he wouldn't have put me in that position. I knew that from the start. But I found him, he was quieter than when he was Mr. Presents, as Jim Warren used to call him. But I was sorry that a lot of people didn't get to see that side of him either, the concerned brother. And of course, Larry and Stan were related to Martin Goodman. They were today. Jason Goodman is himself not entirely sure whether they're cousins or something else, but it was family, and so that had its own weird dynamics as well. And Stan was having to intervene, and I can attest to this firsthand from my later dealings at Atlas. He had to be a buffer between Martin and insane creative people, and I don't mean that in a psychological way. I mean, they were just all over the place and creative, and a lot of money was going out, and it was a tough position to be in for Stan.
Yeah. Do you think it hurt, or from when you were in the business, did Marvel having Stan as a figurehead going out there and talking to everyone and, in front of the camera and stuff like that, how much did that help Marvel's sales, and how much do you think that hurt DC and their sales, not having a figurehead themselves like that?
It's kind of ironic when you think about it, that the Fantastic Four was created as a response to Justice League of America, and which was doing exceptionally well. And so Martin wanted a team. And when Fantastic Four came out, and Amazing Fantasy with Spider-Man and the rest of them, yes, Stan as a figurehead was important, clearly. I think he went overboard, renting Carnegie Hall and having a night with Stan and the bullpen. But what he brought, the sensibility he brought, was so essential. That whole real world shtick, Spider-Man not able to cash a check made out to Spider-Man, all of that practical stuff, which didn't push it too far, but made people stop and think, hey, wait a minute, right? These are real people, and I can relate to them because they have problems like I do. And girlfriend problems. I mean, how much of Spider-Man was devoted to Flash and Mary Jane and Gwen and Peter, and dating problems and having to run off and fight a villain in the middle of that. That was all Stan. The buttoned up quality you referred to was still DC being DC of the early Silver Age. And that was good for the post-war super science era. But what happened was the industry slipped into the counterculture revolution without realizing it. Stan was perfectly poised to merge with that. DC was not. And Carmine, which was one reason that Bill Gaines was brought in, Carmine had responded by, we'll do Sergeant Rock with a melee type story. We'll do Speedy in Green Lantern, Green Arrow as a drug addict. And what that did was it got them a lot of publicity, the front cover of the New York Times Magazine, and diminished sales. Because I used to, for Carmine, he would make little pictures of little photographs of each cover, and I would put them in a ledger with the sales figures, and they were only going in one direction. Wonder Woman was losing money for as long as I was there, and the other ones were just dropping. If not for licensing, DC would have been in a lot of trouble. And so Carmine's response to that was, well, I'll get Jack Kirby, or I'll get Steve Ditko. And I think that those comics were terrific. I mean, the New Gods and Hawk and Dove and all of that. They were Creeper. They were terrific comics, but they didn't have the magic that Stan brought. And again, that's no knock against any of the writers, but Stan was special and he had a unique perspective. And by the same token, Stan, without Jack and Steve and Dick Ayers and all those other guys, was also limited. Nobody got him the way they did.
Right.
So
that's an excellent point. From your time there, who were some underrated or underappreciated talent, either writer, artist, or people behind the scenes that really helped get these books going that maybe don't get the attention that they deserve?
I think most of them seem to have gotten the attention. For example, I was working with Joe Orlando when the first Swamp Thing was in production, and Bernie Wrightson and Len Wein, I think got a fair share of credit, and as much as anybody got in comics. And Joe actually let Bernie color the first issue, which worked out terribly, and Bernie admitted it and said, I will never do that again. So they got credit. I think actually Joe Orlando never got the credit he deserved, because he was not big on pushing himself forward. He was just happy to do the work. I think Mary Screenis, the writer, didn't go as far as she should have at DC. I can't explain that because she was awfully good. And I know Elliot Maggin did a lot of work there, Carrie Bates. But for some reason, those names are not hoisted up the flagpole the way some of the others are. And I know Carrie had actually sold a treatment to Cubby Broccoli for a James Bond movie that Neil did the storyboards for. So he was ready to move on too. There were just Dan Green was an artist, I think, who didn't get a lot of attention. But they were all so phenomenally talented. It really was, sort of like Renaissance Italy. We had these incredibly gifted people converging at one time at DC. The people at Marvel were good, let's face it, but this was something else. At Kaluta, of course, and what an exciting time to be there. And that was when the DC got the rights to the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. So there was Tarzan and Joe Kubert doing that. And Joe would sit down and just draw it. I have a drawing he did on my wall, which I can show you. You're on a video.
Wow.
He just sat down and drew that. Creativity. It was almost too much, really.
And I'm so glad you brought up Bates and Maggin, because you look at
in the number of comics they did over a period of time, like Mag with that long run on Superman, and the stories they told, and it's that kind of creativity to be there for as long as they were, writing so many kind of different books as well. It's truly amazing.
It is, and but you have to remember again, who were they working with? We're talking about Julie Schwartz, and Julie could be a pain in the ass, but he knew his stuff. And I'll tell you who doesn't get enough credit is E. Nelson Bridwell. This guy was a genius. He was one of the best writers for comics ever, and he does not get the attention. His run on the Inferior Five was one of the wittiest, funniest, most inspired runs ever. And he was not an approachable human being, but boy, what he put down on paper was terrific. And Bob Oxner and Sheldon Mayer, all of these earlier era greats are not remembered the way they should be, not celebrated.
I agree 100%. So let's talk Atlas. Did they approach you and say, would you like to come over, or did you reach out to them?
Well, I had actually gone from DC to Warren, so I was at Warren Publishing Company. And I do want to say a couple of words about that, if I may, before we get to Atlas, because it's chronological anyway. That was an incredibly inspiring place to be. Bill Dubay was the editor then. He was brilliant. There is someone who is under-recognized for what he achieved with Eerie and Creepy and Vampirella. Those were so moribund when he came over and brought in a lot of these Selecciones Illustradas illustrators, Pepe Gonzalez and Enrich and Sanjulian and all of those guys. And it gave Warren a new, fresh, and distinctive look. And he had a lot of Reed Crandall was drawing there. Not very well at that time, but still he was there. And then you had Jim himself, who was he was a hard businessman. There was no question about it. But he was a creative guy as well. One of the most unique people I've ever met in the comic book industry. When he had the chance to get Will Eisner for The Spirit, he jumped at it. I don't think he thought for a second about what it was going to cost, whether he would make money. It didn't. He wanted to be the publisher of The Spirit, his own childhood fantasy, right? So Will Eisner was up in that office, and I remember when Ken Kelly did the first cover, and when Kelly was a great guy, very affable, and Will didn't like the first cover, and Warren had a really difficult job at that point because Ken was one of his top cover artists. His stuff sold. Bill was his new asset. And he said, okay, Will, tell you what, let's go out with this on the first cover. And then for the second, you can draw the cover and Bill Dubay will color it. And so Bill quickly learned, and again, this was one of his incredible talents, the coloring process that Rich Corbin used for his colors, and about doing layers of gray in order to create a color, and how you visualize this. It's like Mozart hearing music in his head. I couldn't do it. But Corbin, another titan. I had to show him around New York for 2 days. But again, these people were just, Corbin was unassuming, and considering all that he had done in the undergrounds, and I still have the correspondence between Corbin and Joe Kubert from when I was at DC. Kubert wanted him to draw for DC, and Corbin said, I can't work for mainstream comics governed by the Comics Code. And Joe Kubert wrote back, part of me wants to applaud someone who sticks up for his principles. On the other hand, didn't it give you kind of a thrill to tell DC to go screw itself? I mean, again, those inside looks at how these people operated. But Jim was just amazing, and Bill was a 24/7 creative talent, and those magazines were just phenomenal at that time. But then I saw in May of 1974, I was still at Warren, I saw an ad in the New York Times, editor comic books. I answered it. A couple of days later, Martin Goodman called me in my apartment at 330 West 45th Street. And I thought it was a joke, but then I remembered I'd answered the ad. And he said, are you free for lunch? I want to talk to you about this project. So I was free for lunch, and of course went to see him. And he was frank. He told me that he had offered. He was starting a new company. He had offered the job to Roy Thomas. Roy turned him down because he just got a contract from Marvel, and he said he would feel uncomfortable not signing it at that point. And others from Marvel and DC were afraid to leave those companies for fear that there would be retribution. I had no such fears because the opportunity to work with Martin Goodman was exciting, and to conceptualize all these new titles was even more exciting. So at that lunch, he asked me to come up with a couple of ideas and bring it to the next lunch, which was about a week later, which is where his son, Chip Goodman, would also be. Now, let me stick a pin in that and tell you that Martin had sold Marvel Comics to Cadence Industries. Martin had founded Marvel in 1939 and sold it with the provision that he would stay on as an advisor for a number of years. That part of the contract was fulfilled, and he left with the understanding that his son would continue to be the president and publisher. Stan did not like that idea. So Stan went to Cadence and said, either Chip goes or I go. Chip was gone. The fix was in. And so Martin was furious. And that was the reason that Atlas came to be known as Vengeance Incorporated, because he just wanted to get comics out there now. He wanted to hurt them in some way now, and he wanted to give Chip employment now. Later on, when they bought Swank magazine, which was not a part of the company originally, Chip's interests shifted. But at the start, the plan was that Larry Lieber, the other editor, and I would put out 5 color comics, I think it was, and 3 or 4 black and white magazines. We were going to pay higher rates, and so on and so forth. That was explained to me at the second lunch. So I told Martin and Chip my ideas, which were for Phoenix, Devilina, Scorpion, Grim Ghost, a couple of others. They both liked them. I had actually written the script for Phoenix because I think Martin wanted to make sure I could type, if nothing else. And so he actually flipped through it and then hired me. All right, so we started up, and almost at once there was a great deal of pushback. DC instituted a policy to return art and pay higher rates as long as you worked exclusively for DC. And he put that in a memo, which was kind of insane. Marvel took a different approach. They started doing reprints that were designed to keep us off the newsstands. So if you're a news dealer, what are you going to do? Put up another Spider-Man title or put up, Morlock 2001? Of course, you're going to go with Spider-Man. So Martin's response to that was, we're going to flood the newsstands with comics. We've got to do something to hold on to the rack space and try to push back against Marvel. So all of a sudden, we were doing 21 color comics. And Larry kind of collapsed under the stress. Look, I don't know much about his dynamic, or I know that he was constantly on edge. And Rick Myers, who was my assistant, I delegated him to integrate with Larry as much as interface with Larry as much as possible, because Larry did not like what we were doing. He wanted to do things like Marvel was doing. That's what he knew. And he convinced Martin that that's what we should be doing too. Now, I declined at first because we had things that were neither Marvel nor DC. We had, Iron Jaw. We had Wolf. Larry Hama, another insanely great talent. We had Howie on the Scorpion. We had Ernie doing Tiger Man, and the Grim Ghost, and Michael Michael Fleischer writing for us, and we were really pushing this stuff out. And I remember telling Martin and Chip that if we were to suddenly change course before we even know what the sales are, fans are not going to stick with us. So Martin let that go for a second issue. Chip asked to know more about the Atlas universe. Now, as it happened, I had come up with a chart that showed how everything was connected. How Devilina was related to Tarantula, how Vicky was related to Tarantula, how Ironjaw was related to Planet of Vampires. There was this massive universe plan without other dimensions, without going back in time. It was all a linear progression from the earliest Cro-Mag the Caveman way out to Ironjaw, and it's his post-apocalyptic world. And so everything, I told every writer that, don't take it personally, but there are times when I'm going to have to make sure things fit with the whole master plan. So we started pushing out these titles, and a lot of the Young Turks that I had referred to had trouble meeting these deadlines. And I admit they were brutal deadlines, and I admit that they changed from 2 weeks out to 1 week out. Nobody liked that. I don't blame them, but I wasn't as good an interface as Stan was, because 22, and really all that Rick and I wanted to do at that point. Now, Rick had come to me from the University of Bridgeport. He just came in for an interview, and I was impressed with some of the things he brought up, like Target. Like Lomax. I mean, there were things that he was so good at, that police, Sergeant Stryker, and military and CIA type stuff. And he had just a stack of ideas, and I just went through them and said, yes, no, but yes. So he knew how to run with those. Exactly what I needed, which is where Target came from. Mm-hmm. Larry had some vague ideas for police action. All right, we settled on Lomax, Luke Malone. We're gonna do that. And Sergeant Stryker. The name came from I remember Zero Hour. I think it was a Dana Andrews movie about a crazy damaged pilot that Rick and I really loved. Rick and I spoke the same language, and we wanted to homage everything. The Cougar was Burt Lancaster in disguise, but the Cougar was actually related to Sergeant Stryker in a connective tissue sort of way. So we had this. I was going insane working all this out, but it was glorious. And then it just crashed. It crashed because Chip got interested in Swank. They had bought Swank at that time. Martin became disinterested because at 21 titles a month, plus thrilling adventure stories, Devilina, Macabre, and movie monsters in the black and white arena, money was going out like he had not expected. He had invested in some movies that flopped. I was never to do anything about skiing because he invested in a Jean-Claude Keely movie and didn't want to be reminded of that. He was angry that I had done something about Lawrence of Arabia. Anyway, um, so Martin had pretty much withdrawn. Chip was distracted by Swank because they paid a lot for that, and that was really more viable as a future to him. And as it turned out, when he founded his next publishing company, um, Goodman Media, I think it was, he did very traditional magazines about log cabins and drugs and all of that stuff. So his interest was gone, and he didn't have the patience, the interest, the acumen, anything to deal with what I was showing him or the personalities who were coming into the office. There was Howard Nostrand, who had been Neil Adams' mentor and who drew the Ben Casey comic strip, had come up to draw a target. But he was volatile, and I remember he threw a knife at Rick's foot and threw Rick against the wall. And I had to get his attention by burying a T-square in the plasterboard. It was not a happy environment, and Chip, again, understandably, did not want his staff being thrown against the wall or knifed. So I said to Chip, look, we're busting our asses here. Can we just have some autonomy to run this thing? And I wrote him a long memo saying, look, here's where we want this to go. Here's what we want to do. And he called me in and said, no. And I said, okay, I gotta go. I can't do this. We're burning out, and we're not getting the results or support that we want. And mind you, only 2 issues had come out of everything. So we still didn't have sales reports. Those took 90 days to come in, and the 3rd issues were in production. And I left, and Rick stayed, and Larry immediately did a 180, killed everything that I had been doing, made everything more like Marvel, and it was such a contrived, bad, ill-advised Hail Mary pass that I don't even consider those comics to be part of the I mean, they killed Morlock in his own comic.
Yeah.
He broke Cougar's back in the 2nd issue, and okay, I could have worked with that if Chip had wanted that, but he really screwed up the hands of the Dragon, because I've been a martial arts person since I was a kid, and I studied with this one guy named Johnny Kuhl, Kuhl, who was a brilliant karate instructor and bodyguard and everything. And so I really had wanted Hands of the Dragon to be, unlike the Chopsaki movies, a legitimate martial arts comic book, and that would showcase both Japanese and Chinese styles. And it just went way into some other crazy direction once I left. And needless to say, I stopped reporting to Stan. And I think it lasted another 3 months, maybe. Yeah. And it was just such a crushing defeat. And that's the saga in a nutshell of Atlas.
I would say, as a young man, there's from what you're describing, there's so much pressure on you at the time. How are you handling that pressure? Because you're basically trying to keep this company afloat. You have a lot of people you're trying to keep happy to get work coming in. How are you yourself handling all that's going on?
I would sleep in the office a lot, and I know the first time I did that, Martin was angry because he came in and found me sleeping on his sofa. There was no oh wow, you really put in a full night in addition to a full day.
Right.
And I'll tell you, the other thing that really frustrated me was that in our after hours, Rick and I had started putting together a second comic book line for Seaboard Periodicals, which was going to be called Timeless. Now, Timeless, of course, was a play on Marvel's Timely on Martin Goodman's Timely, just as Atlas was a play on Martin Goodman's Atlas. And it was going to exist in the same universe as Atlas, but on different worlds. And with the linchpin being the connective tissue being the world of Wolf the Barbarian, because we had not even gotten to introduce the big bad in our Atlas universe, which was Hades, Haydes, the father of Satan, and the father of Devilina. And he, at the time of Wolf the Barbarian and Iron John, he would have been exiled to that world. That was the whole thing, was based on Paradise Lost. I tried to steal pretentiously from the best. So this was going to be John Milton to a T. Just like the whole idea for the integrated universe was really Edgar Rice Burroughs' conceit for John Carter, Carson of Venus, Tarzan, Pellucidar. All these things interacted, and I remember as a kid being just so amazed at that. And so I wanted to do that with Atlas too. The Marvel universe was a little bit reverse engineered. It was, we have Daredevil, we have Spidey. Should they meet? Should they be Avengers? What should happen to these guys? And I always felt that those things were kind of forced. In much the same way that, okay, we accepted World's Finest with Batman and Superman. Justice League, I don't know, this Flash and Green Lantern, did I really have time to do all of this stuff? But I wanted to do that with Atlas. So it was a defeat for not just Atlas, but the idea for Timeless, which had 50 new characters. My favorite, by the way, being the Headless Horsewoman. I just absolutely love the concept that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and the thing is, we were very ahead of the curve. Remember, this was New York of 1974 and 5. I had come off of working with Gloria Steinem. Gay liberation was making inroads. The civil rights movement was in memory at Grain, and so we included as much as possible. Rick and I, what we now call diversity and inclusion. Not because we were prescient or necessarily wanting to be social justice warriors, but only because it seemed more representative of New York, where we were living then. And I remember Martin, on one of the covers of Planet of Vampires was concerned because we had a black character on the cover. So he made me make her white. She was still black. She was drawn black. She had an afro. But she was now white, which was just another stop. Please make this stop. So the Headless Horsewoman was going to be a Native American who had been beheaded and went around seeking vengeance against the colonials who had assaulted her. And at some point, I thought it would be really fun if we ever had a crossover, that the Grim Ghost would be sent to reap her soul by Satan, and they would end up becoming partners, So again, we were so focused on all of this to the exclusion of everything else almost. And all of a sudden it just was over.
Yes.
And at least for then. And I was happy that I had a book contract to do a film book, but I wasn't going to go back into a situation like that. Warren very kindly took me back as a freelancer after I had competed with him. I think just so he could continually pour salt in my failure. But that's fine. I deserved it. I took some of his ideas like mail order and ran with it and ran away with it. So and a Monster magazine too. So anyway,
it's to me, it just seems like there's a core group of you guys who are truly invested in Atlas, truly invested in building it and creating, like you said, this universe that you came up with. How am I going to put this?
Was everyone else there as invested as you, or was it a job for a lot of people and they were just sort of getting a paycheck and taking off?
Um, Steve Mitchell, who was the first art director, who was an inker at DC, was invested.
Hmm.
Martin and Chip didn't get along with him, and they replaced him with a guy who was not invested, who was doing production on the crossword puzzle magazines that Seaboard published. So nobody. I mean, I think Howie and a couple of the artists and writers were invested in the sense that I know Michael Fleischer was, because he took a big chance coming over. Everybody wanted to see it succeed, because if they went down with the ship, it was going to be bad news going back to Marvel or DC, if they could at all. That prevented a lot of people from coming over. I know I actually appreciated deeply the courage of Sal Amendola, who drew Phoenix for us, for leaving DC and coming over right away. And you know, one of the ways that I enticed him was Sal is devoutly religious, and I said, what would make you happy to draw in Phoenix? And he said, icons. So I decided, okay, that doesn't require a tweak in the script. Just go ahead and make Phoenix, you know, a Jesus surrogate. I'm great with that. And so he ended up in cruciform poses. He ended up in, you know, parting the seas like Moses. It was just really exciting to work with guys like that. So
Yeah.
Sal was invested. John Albano came over. And in fact, John had an appointment to see me when I quit. He left with me. He didn't think, oh, I need to get a paycheck or
Yeah.
whatever. No, he walked out. He said, it's not going to be any fun without you. And I always treasured that. And so John was invested, Sal. And I know so many people were disappointed in the way it all worked out. But boy, there was no stopping that flow of water downward. You
Yeah.
know, it was just you know, you had a bucket at best, and eventually it was all swept away. So no, I don't think anybody was. I know Larry was not invested. Larry just he wanted to be doing Marvel, and indeed went back to Marvel when it folded. You know, all of his stuff was, everything he drew was based on Kirby. And I felt bad in retrospect, because he was insecure. I mean, let's face it, you're Stan's brother. It's a tough shadow to live under.
Mhm.
And it's just, stuff wasn't getting done. And when it was, there was a real divide in, you know, Frank Giacoia and Jack Abel and the people he was familiar with from Marvel. This is not to disparage their talent. They were terrific, but it was a Marvel look. And when they started inking our covers, when the second issue of Wolf, I think it was Frank Giacoia, was told by Martin to take that incredible piece of art and stick a witch woman in the image, where she didn't belong, and have word balloons. It was heartbreaking, and there was nothing I could say to Larry or anybody else that would have made it better.
Right. It seems like right now fans are rediscovering Atlas. You know, I'm seeing it more and more on Facebook and things like that. People, you know, coming across these comics. Is there a future still, do you think, for Atlas, or
Yeah.
are these characters?
Yes, there is. And I have to say, first of all, I was not a fan of the 2010-2011 reboot. It was not Atlas to me. There was a zeitgeist. As I mentioned earlier, it was a combination of the end of the Silver Age, in my mind, meets the pre-Rudy Giuliani grime and crime of New York. It was. I think the character that came closest to capturing that was the Dark Avenger, which was a backup strip by the incredibly talented Pat Broderick in Phoenix #3. And you know, and one reason I didn't I was upset about Timeless is because we had an entire urban line that had originally going to be part of Atlas. Martin shot it down, and so Rick and I just took it over to our Timeless concept. Um, uh, so the 2010-11 reboot just didn't. Grim Ghost should not have become Spawn, in my judgment. He was much more. I had patterned him after Marlon Brando's Fletcher Christian and Mutiny on the Bounty, this kind of foppish, snarky, upper crust individual. And I actually gave Ernie art from the souvenir book of Mutiny on the Bounty to use as reference. So I wasn't a fan of that. And it was widely announced a couple of years ago that Atlas had been sold for movies. COVID and a change of personnel put that on the back burner. I can't say more than the fact that it is back on the front burner, and think things will be happening. I'm not free to discuss them, and I am super excited to be a part of that. More than that, what I said to you earlier about the universe having its own plan, it took almost 50 years to get to this point, but ye of little faith, here we are. So I am going to be very happy and excited to talk more about that when I can. Jason Goodman, the third generation is working closely with me on that, and our producing people, and it's just been going wonderfully.
I just want to mention you've had a brilliant career in writing the video game books, encyclopedia superheroes, supervillains, biographies, autobiographies with celebrities, all sorts of things you've been a part of. And next time we have you on, I really want to dive into that as well. But comic books, could you, looking back now, have seen a career where you had stayed in comics the entire time, or did you need to branch out and try different things?
If Atlas had survived, there would have been no reason to leave Atlas. That would have been at that time, at my age, a dream come true. Again, what I experienced after that, the book that I was working on when I left Atlas was the films of Charlton Heston, and a big hero of mine as a kid. Well, now I had time to go out and interview him if he was willing, and he was willing. He was willing. So I got to go out and interview Charlton Heston, and we became friends. And I was actually in his office up in Coldwater Canyon one day when he got a call from a producer who wanted to do a remake or a sequel to Ben-Hur. And Heston waited a second. He said, the horses are all dead. And I thought that was such a great way to diffuse what was a bad idea. So yeah, that was exciting. To be able to do pulp novels was exciting. To work with William Shatner on a series of novels and on a nonfiction book, with Gillian Anderson on a series of novels.
Tom Clancy, you worked with.
Well, Tom Clancy, I actually only met Tom Clancy once. He was not involved, but for almost 30 years, I was doing Tom Clancy's Op Center, which was the first ghosted Tom Clancy series until they had to put my name on the cover. But the last one I did just came out a couple of months ago. And I'm grateful. I have been stupidly lucky with all of that. I'm just so grateful for the way that panned out. I mean, How to Win at Nintendo, I was hired as a consultant when Donkey Kong was being sued by King Kong, and I got an early look at Nintendo, and I said to myself, okay, I've played Atari, I've played Intellivision, this is something else. And so I convinced one of my editors at St. Martin's, Elizabeth Beyer, this thing is going to be huge. You have to let me do a book on how to win at Nintendo. And she said, you know, you were right about Jason Priestley and Luke Perry on 90210. We sold a lot of those books. Let's go. So we sold 8 million copies of those. And again, that was the kind of validation. If that had happened at Atlas, I would have been so ecstatic. But okay, so it came later. How to Win a Trivial Pursuit, joke books. It was just a cornucopia of stuff. And then when I was doing interviews for Ladies Home Journal and Omni magazines, Ladies Home Journal sent me out to do a interview with the Designing Women on CBS. And the producer, Harry Thomason, was interested that I had a lot of contacts in the tabloid field, the Inquirer, the Globe, the Star. He called me into his office, closed the door, and he said, Jeff, one of my best friends is going to be running for president, governor of Arkansas. Would you consider coming out here and do catch and kill, run interference on stories that are going to come out? I said, yeah. So I went out and lived at the Sheraton Universal and, worked with the Clintons. It ended up at the White House. My wife and I went to the inauguration in '97. It was insane. It was insane. All of this from what? From leaving the School of Visual Arts after 3 weeks, or from working with Ian Ballantyne. No, I have in retrospect, no regrets about Atlas, and I'm insanely grateful for all of this. You know, at Atlas, we had tried to get the rights to Godzilla. Heston had actually tried to help me get the rights to the Omega Man, which failing that, because Warner Brothers DC is why I came up with Planet of Vampires. You know, I'll show you. We can do vampires too. All of those things were setbacks, but we persevered. You know, I had Walt Simonson draw giant monster comics that were never published. I think he put some of those pages up on his Facebook page. So yeah, you know, there have been regrets up and down the line, but good God, who could sit here and gripe about any of this? Really, I'm just very grateful.
I didn't say for your comic career, your bosses have been Stanley, Martin Goodman, Bill Gaines, Carmine. I mean,
Jim Warren,
yeah. Jim Warren, like the biggest of the big, and you knew them and you worked with them, and that's just that's like you have sometimes, you know, as a comic fan, you must sometimes sit back and be like, I knew these dudes, like all these fellas, these legends, you knew them.
Yeah, and not to belabor this point, but it didn't stop there. When I left Atlas, one of the first places I went up to was Analog Science Fiction magazine, where Ben Bova was the editor. I didn't know Ben, but he was very charitable towards struggling writers. So I went up there, and somebody sitting in the office, and I told Ben I was working on, I had written a book called The Pictorial History of Science Fiction Films, and I was working on this book with Charlton Heston. So Ben looks up to the guy in the corner and said, Isaac, could this guy do what you can't do? So Isaac Asimov said, I was asked to write the year in science fiction for the Encyclopedia of Britannica, I forget which one. Could you do that? I said, yes, sir. And he went to the phone and called the Encyclopedia, and he said, never mind, I have someone who can do it for you. And I got that gig. Right? I mean, the whole thing is crazy. It's crazy. So, yeah, so it happened on so many fronts. When I was up at Manor Books, the guy sitting next to me in the lobby said, you know, I'm sick and tired of writing this police series I'm writing. It's trash. And I was writing a detective series. And well, I need the money. He said, I need the money too, but I got to do my own thing. So Nelson DeMille went off and wrote By the Rivers of Babylon and became Nelson DeMille. It's just been an insane journey. And I was privileged. Yes, I still pinch myself that I knew these people. Jack Kirby called me at 3 a.m. because he was in California, saying he couldn't work for Atlas. Okay, you wake me up anytime, just whatever. It's crazy. It's crazy. So
It's awesome though.
yeah. No, and you know, I could go on, but the thing is, it's I am here because all of these people, I even want to go back to Mary Shelley, invented the sandbox that I've been privileged to play in. And whenever possible, I like to call attention to that. I don't want when Jillian and I were doing book promotion for our novels. First thing I told people, to the horror of the publisher, was leave this, go buy a copy of Frankenstein. Okay, that's the teenage girl who invented, who's in whose debt we are.
Yeah.
And I don't think James Cameron is pretty much one of the few filmmakers who does this, but he really credits the creators that came before. And I think that's so important because we're forgetting, and when my generation is gone, we're going to forget even more. Who paved the way? Who knows besides us who Alex Raymond is now, and yet how important he and Hal Foster and Lee Falk were to the evolution of the superhero and the comic book. Arguably, without Zorro, without the Phantom, we wouldn't be here talking about anything. And going back further, without the Scarlet Pimpernel. Yeah, I think that was 1903. It's so important, and it's important that when we talk about the Man of Steel, we talk about the Man of Bronze, Doc Savage. It's important when we talk about Batman that we talk about the Bat and the Shadow. Who knows who Walter Gibson is anymore? Who wrote those novels sometimes every 2 weeks?
Right.
You know, it's crazy, but we owe those people everything. Burroughs, without John Carter, where would Star Wars be? And Flash Gordon and Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum. We have to keep alive the memory of these creators.
Amen to that. Yeah. So, where can fans find out what you're up to? Any new projects coming up? How can fans keep up with what you're doing?
Listen to your podcast, because I haven't. I don't have a website or a functioning Facebook page. I just really. I would much rather. The reason this podcast is so good, what you do, and I've listened to several of them, is because you encourage people to talk about their inspiration. It's not me. I did this, I did that. You know. I know Howie was talking about. I mean, he got some things wrong about Atlas, but that's okay. Memory fades, and I kept very detailed notebooks and date books, which I still have. So fortunately, I can remember a lot more. But talking about Walt and the friendship that they had, that stuff is never going to be recognized unless people come to a place like this and to Dollarbin and talk about it and memorialize it. And not that I think it's as important as any kind of memories of veterans or stuff like that. But it Paul Levitz put it in an interesting way once. We were having lunch, and I said, you seem a little distressed. He said, well, it was just occurring to me that we won. What do you mean? He said, it's all bigger than us now. We used to be a ghetto. We used to be a little community. He said, now I'm making deals. I've got the Salkins calling me. We're talking about TV shows and Flash and all of that. He said, it's wonderful. It's exciting, but it's not what it was. And we have to tell about what it was. We have to talk about the pressures that Stan was under, that Carmine was under, the cultural forces of the war in Vietnam and all of the civil rights and liberation movements impacting comic books. Yeah. I remember when Dorothy did a Lois Lane Black Like Me comic where she goes into a machine and comes out black. It was, even at the time, I thought that was kind of tacky, but I knew what she was trying to do. And I don't want those things lost in the dustbin.
Yeah.
And it's so perishable.
And we're back. That was a cool interview, Warren. As always, it's a great way to kick off the new year with a only Orin episode. That was just a home run.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, when Jeff was talking about the sort of the blueprint he had for the Atlas universe, I would love to see how that gets all pieced together with the different books and how they all tie together. It really shows the creativity of his mind to put all those different titles and all those different characters together into one universe. That absolutely fascinated with me.
As always, great job for an Orin only episode, Orin. We continue to stockpile these, and you'll hear more Orin only episodes. I know there are the Orin only fans out there, so we appreciate it. Great job, and thank you, Jeff, for coming on the show. So that'll do it for this episode and this week of episodes on the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. We will be back next week with a new episode. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you next issue.